Las Vegas, 1972. The Hilton International glowed like a jewel in the desert night. The orchestra thundered, spotlights blazed, and Elvis, draped in a white cape embroidered with gold, had just finished an American trilogy. The audience roared, cheers, whistles, a storm of applause. And then it happened. A single voice, raw and unflinching, cut through the ovation. "Elvis, you're unjustly rich. You've forgotten the common people." The hall froze. Applause collapsed into silence so sharp it felt like glass shattering. Even the television camera swiveled, catching the defiant man in its lens. He wasn't drunk, wasn't raving. His eyes burned with conviction. He meant every word. On stage, Elvis didn't flinch. He raised his hand, halting the orchestra. The cape shimmered as he stepped forward, not with anger, not with arrogance, but with a calm that unsettled the room. His gaze swept across the stunned audience, then back to the lone accuser. Something was about to happen. Something that would echo far beyond Las Vegas, into headlines and history. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The Hilton Hotel in Las Vegas shimmered like a cathedral of light that night. Outside, the desert air was dry and restless, but within its walls, everything pulsed with a peculiar mixture of glamour and tension. Elvis Presley was preparing to step on stage again, the very man who had turned Las Vegas into his second kingdom. His concerts were more than music. They were rituals, spectacles, nights people never forgot. Yet behind the glitter of sequins and the roar of applause lingered an unease that could not be silenced by amplifiers. In the hours leading up to the show, the corridors backstage buzzed with whispers, not about his set list, not about the orchestra, but about money. His money. A journalist from one of the Hilton-affiliated papers had just published a sharp piece mocking his rhinestone-covered jumpsuits and diamond-studded belts. The article listed their staggering costs in detail, as if each stone were an accusation. By the time Elvis was fastening his wide collar in front of the mirror, every member of the crew had already read it. The air was thick with it. Elvis could sense the change without needing to hear the words. He caught it in the way two technicians lowered their voices when he entered the room, the awkward pause in their laughter, the sidelong glance at the glittering white suit he was about to wear. He caught fragments, half-murmured phrases. "Forgotten what it's like. Just another king in his palace." They probably thought he hadn't noticed, but he noticed everything tonight. The suit he was putting on seemed heavier than usual, as though each rhinestone carried not only light, but judgment. He ran a hand along the fabric, feeling the embroidery that had taken weeks of labor. To the newspapers, it was excess, a symbol of detachment from ordinary life. To him, it was armor. But armor can cut both ways, protecting the man who wears it while provoking those who only see its shine. He sat down in the dressing chair and stared into the mirror. The reflection was unmistakable. Jet black hair, carefully styled. Dark eyes framed with fatigue he could not quite hide. A jawline that still carried the same stubborn fire as in the days of Tupelo. Yet even as he looked at himself, he wondered how much of this man the audience still remembered. Did they still see the boy who grew up in poverty, whose mother washed clothes for neighbors just to keep food on the table? Or had the Cadillac, the airplanes, and the Graceland gates erased that story from their minds? The irony stung. He had fought his whole life to climb out of the mud, to lift his family out of desperation. Now, the very evidence of that victory, the wealth, the gifts, the homes, was used as a weapon against him. He thought of his father once again telling him in the kitchen of Graceland, "Son, they'll love you when you give. and hate you when you keep. Tonight, those words pressed on him like prophecy. Outside, the audience was already filling the theater. The Hilton's hall was not merely a room, it was a furnace of anticipation, packed with tourists, casino high rollers, blue-collar couples who had saved for months just to see him, and critics who had come to take notes. Elvis knew that in every corner a camera waited. The management had invited extra press, aware that any flare of scandal or drama would fill the next morning's headlines. A singer could lose his voice and recover, but a tarnished reputation clung like smoke. As the orchestra rehearsed their opening cues, Elvis leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. He thought of the gossip among the crew, of the articles still wet with ink, of the murmurings he could already imagine among the crowd. Does he even remember us? Does he understand what a paycheck means? Or does he just throw money on Cadillacs and diamonds? For a moment, he felt the walls of the dressing room shrink. His chest tightened, not from fear of performance, that had never been his weakness, but from the knowledge that tonight he was walking into a hall that did not only want music, they wanted an answer, though none of them would admit it. The jumpsuit sparkled as he rose, fastening the last clasp with deliberate calm. He told himself he was ready. Still, he could not ignore the sensation that hovered in the room, an invisible weight pressing down, the judgment of strangers who believed his life had become untouchable, too far removed from theirs. He heard the knock on the door, 2 sharp raps. It was Joe Esposito, his road manager. 5 minutes, E. Elvis nodded, but did not move right away. He remained by the mirror, staring into the eyes that seemed both familiar and foreign. He whispered, so low only the walls heard him, "Don't let me forget where I came from." In the corridor, footsteps echoed, bodyguards shifting position, stagehands hauling cables, the muffled rumble of the crowd growing restless. From the hall came the faintest chant, his name, stretched into a wave, swelling, then fading. They didn't know the thoughts that tightened around him like a noose. They would only see the shine, never the doubt beneath it. As he stepped into the corridor, a young lighting assistant brushed past, whispering to another worker just a little too loudly, "He's not the same. Not the boy from Memphis anymore." Elvis's jaw clenched. He didn't turn, didn't rebuke them. He simply walked on, but the words burned hotter than the spotlights waiting on stage. He carried them with him, step by step. As he neared the curtain, the MC's voice thundered into the hall. The band struck its opening chord, and the crowd erupted. But Elvis paused at the threshold, just behind the velvet curtain, and for one suspended heartbeat, he understood that this night would not be like the others. The applause felt different. Louder, yes, but edged with something else. Expectation, doubt, even challenge. And he knew, without question, that somewhere out there in the mass of faces was a spark that would ignite. The moment the curtain lifted, the room erupted with sound. The Hilton's main showroom swelled with cheers, whistles, and the rumble of applause. Spotlights blazed against the sequins of Elvis's suit, scattering tiny bursts of light across the walls. He stood tall, microphone in hand, every inch the showman. The band hit the first few notes, the horns sharp and confident, the rhythm tight as a drumline in battle. For a few minutes, it was as though nothing could disturb the magic. But then it came. A voice, rough and unpolished, cutting across the polished chords like a blade across silk. "You live like a king while the rest of us starve." The words boomed from somewhere in the middle rows. At first, many thought they'd misheard. The orchestra hesitated a fraction of a beat. A few singers glanced nervously at one another. The spotlight swept across the hall, but no one needed the beam to know exactly where it had come from. All at once, the air shifted. The joy that had filled the room only seconds ago collapsed into a brittle silence. It wasn't the silence of reverence, it was the silence of shock. Hundreds of people held their breath. Chairs creaked faintly as bodies leaned forward, desperate to see what would follow. Elvis froze, the microphone hovering inches from his lips. His eyes narrowed just slightly, enough for those near the front to sense the tension. The band, trained to follow him without hesitation, fell silent. In that pause, the theater seemed to contract. The hum of the air conditioning and the faint clinking of glasses from the bar suddenly felt deafening. A second voice, a security guard, barked an order. Two men in dark suits started moving down the aisle, weaving through the frozen audience. They were going to drag the troublemaker out, just as they had done countless times when drunks or hecklers went too far. But then Elvis raised his hand. A simple gesture, palm open, steady as stone. The guards halted mid-step. The message was unmistakable. Do not touch him. The audience gasped quietly at the defiance of protocol. It was one thing to ignore an outburst, another to stop security from silencing it. Everyone expected the star to protect his show, to remove the disruption quickly. Instead, he had just invited the moment to grow. From the crowd, the man who had shouted rose to his feet. His face was lined, his shirt collar damp with sweat. He looked like a factory worker, not a gambler or a tourist. His fists trembled at his sides, but his voice carried raw force. You sing about love, Elvis, about hope and faith. But you sit in a mansion behind gates, while families in Memphis can't afford a loaf of bread. Do you remember what that feels like? Or did you forget where you came from? The words rang out like hammer blows. They struck not just Elvis, but everyone listening, because many in that room came from the same struggles. Some nodded faintly, almost ashamed to admit agreement. Others stared at the man with wide eyes, appalled by his daring. A woman near the front pressed her hand to her mouth, tears threatening, while her husband shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw tight. The silence after the man's accusation stretched unbearably long. Elvis did not rush to answer. He stood still, staring directly at him, as though weighing every syllable. The crowd grew restless in the stillness, but no one dared break it. The silence itself became another performer, filling the hall with suspense thicker than any note the orchestra could play. A single cough echoed from the back. Someone muttered, "Sit down." But the man didn't move. He was shaking now, though whether from fear or conviction was impossible to tell. The band members glanced nervously at one another, waiting for some sign from their leader. Even the stage lights seemed hotter, the air denser, as though the very building leaned forward to hear. Elvis finally lowered the microphone to his side. His lips parted, but no words came. Instead, he allowed the pause to deepen, stretching to the edge of what the crowd could bear. It was a deliberate act. Whether instinct or strategy, it gripped the audience like a fist. Every face in the hall mirrored anticipation. Some fans clenched their programs, knuckles white. Others looked away, unable to meet the tension head-on. The theater had transformed from a concert hall into a courtroom. The man on stage, no longer just an entertainer, but a defendant summoned to answer for his life. And in that frozen stillness, one thing was clear. Whatever words Elvis chose next would decide more than the success of the evening. They would decide whether he was still one of them, or whether the divide between the king and his kingdom had grown too wide to bridge. The room remained locked in silence, the kind of silence that prickles at the skin, when every second without sound feels heavier than the last. Elvis let it linger. He had always known the power of a pause. On stage, silence could be louder than thunder. He rested the microphone against his thigh, eyes fixed on the man who had hurled the accusation. His chest rose and fell slowly, almost in defiance of the collective breathlessness around him. When he finally lifted the mic back to his lips, his voice was low, measured, almost conversational. "You want to know if I remember?" He looked down for a moment, as though speaking not to the stranger but to the floor beneath his feet. "I remember everything." The crowd leaned in as one. "I remember a shotgun house in Tupelo, Mississippi. One room, wood so thin you could feel the winter come through the cracks. I remember Mama stretching a pot of beans for 3 nights because it was all we had. I remember my daddy being sent away when I was just a boy. Folks in town didn't expect much from us. Poor white trash. That's what they called us. And they weren't wrong. We had nothing." The confession landed in the room like a slow earthquake. Even those who had known the broad outlines of his past rarely heard him speak of it directly. His voice carried no theatrics, no polished stage charm, only raw memory. He lifted his gaze, locking eyes with the man again. "You're right about one thing. I have more than most men ever will. More than I ever dreamed. I walk through a house with chandeliers, and sometimes I wonder if it's even real. But let me ask you this. Do you know how much of it I've given away?" The hall stirred, a ripple of confusion. Elvis took a step closer to the edge of the stage. "I don't put these things in the papers. I don't hire photographers when I help someone. But I've paid hospital bills for people I never met. I've bought houses for widows of soldiers who didn't make it home. I've walked into wards and left checks for nurses who keep the sick alive. Not because I wanted thanks, because I know what it means to be desperate." A murmur rose from the crowd, disbelief mixing with admiration. Elvis's generosity was known in whispers, in scattered stories traded between fans. Hearing it from his own mouth struck differently. Then, with a suddenness that startled even his band, Elvis slipped one of the rings from his finger. The gold caught the spotlight, a flash of brilliance against the dark theater. He held it for a moment in the palm of his hand, studying it as if to remind himself of its worth, or its lack thereof. "This," he said, raising the ring high enough for the audience to see, "this is just metal. Shiny, sure. Costs a lot. But it's not worth more than a breath, not worth more than the sound of a child laughing. Watch." And before anyone could predict it, he tossed the ring into the crowd. The trajectory was deliberate, straight toward the man who had shouted at him. Gasps erupted as hands shot up, a flurry of reaching fingers, but somehow the ring landed in the protester's lap. He stared at it, frozen, his anger momentarily eclipsed by shock. "Take it, friend," Elvis said firmly. "Hold it, sell it, throw it away. Doesn't matter. That's just gold. What I came here to give tonight isn't for sale. It's my voice, my soul, and that belongs to all of you." The hall detonated in applause. Cheers, whistles, even tears. People rose from their chairs, clapping furiously, some screaming his name, others pounding the tables as if trying to push the energy back at him. The force of it nearly shook the room. Yet even within the explosion of sound, there was a shift. Where moments ago suspicion had hovered, there now flickered awe. Many had walked into that hall believing the glitter on his suit defined him. Now they saw a man daring to strip away the illusion in front of them, risking humiliation, in exchange for truth. The man with the ring sat trembling. His jaw moved, but no sound came. His clenched fists had loosened, replaced by something rawer, bewilderment, maybe even shame. Elvis held the moment steady, not rushing to reclaim the stage with music. He wanted the weight of his gesture to sink in, to leave no corner of the room untouched. He let the applause crest, then raised a hand gently, signaling for quiet. The noise softened, wave by wave, until once again there was stillness. Only now it was not the silence of accusation. It was the silence of anticipation. An audience leaning forward, hungry for what he would say next, aware they had just witnessed something unscripted, something too real to be rehearsed. For Elvis, the battle was not over. But for the first time that night, the balance had shifted. The applause after the ring left Elvis's hand felt like a wave crashing against the walls of the Hilton showroom. People were on their feet, clapping until their palms stung, cheering as though they had just witnessed a miracle. The moment had pierced through suspicion, and for a few glorious seconds, the energy in the room was nothing but release. But just as the ovation reached its peak, a voice broke through from the darker edges of the hall. Harsh, loud, unwilling to be drowned out. "Fine gesture, Presley, but you still sleep in a palace." Another voice joined. "You're no working man anymore." The hall, so united a heartbeat ago, rippled with unease. Elvis lowered his head for a moment, breathing deeply. He had known it wouldn't be that simple. For every soul touched, there would always be others who clung to their doubt, to their resentment of anyone who had risen beyond them. He lifted his hand again, palm out, and the cheers quieted. The sudden hush was startling, almost unnerving. Then, in a move that shocked everyone, he walked slowly across the stage and sat down. Not on a throne-like chair, not behind the microphone stand, but directly on the edge of the stage itself. The gesture was electric. There he was, rhinestones glittering under the hot lights, but instead of towering above the audience, he placed himself at their level. His boots dangled a foot above the floor, his posture casual, almost vulnerable. The king of rock and roll had stripped himself of distance. He looked less like a performer and more like a man sitting on a porch, ready to talk. Gasps echoed. Some leaned closer, others exchanged bewildered glances. The security guards stiffened at the edges of the room, confused by his breach of stage decorum. But Elvis kept his gaze locked on the crowd, steady and calm, as though daring them to look him in the eyes. From somewhere near the front, a woman's voice cut through the tension, not sharp like the accusations, but trembling, filled with tears. "Don't listen to them, Elvis," she cried, her words carrying across the stunned silence. "You paid for my boy's surgery when no one else would. He's alive because of you." The room jolted. Heads turned toward her. A middle-aged woman, plain dress, hair pinned back, tears streaming down her cheeks. She clutched her purse as if it anchored her to the moment. The confession was raw, unpolished, impossible to doubt. Murmurs erupted instantly. Some gasped, others whispered to one another. The energy flipped, like a pendulum swinging back. What had moments earlier been a battle of accusations now felt like testimony in a trial. Except this was no rumor, no magazine story. This was flesh and blood, a mother bearing witness. Elvis looked at her, eyes softening. He gave her a small nod, not grand, not theatrical, but personal, as if to say, "I remember, and I'm glad he's still here." The ripple spread. Whispers turned into declarations. A man a few rows back muttered to his wife, "Didn't he buy uniforms for that orphanage?" Another recalled, "I read he gave money to the tornado victims last year." Slowly, the narrative shifted, not because Elvis had defended himself, but because the people themselves began filling in the blanks. Yet the doubters did not vanish. A cluster in the rear still scowled, arms folded tight. Their voices were quieter now, but their presence hung in the air like smoke. Elvis saw them. He knew winning over everyone was impossible, but he also knew the battle was not about silencing them. It was about showing the truth to those who were undecided. He leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees. "You see," he said softly, his southern drawl carrying intimacy through the speakers, "I don't need to stand up high to talk to you. I'm right here. I'll sit down with you, eye to eye. 'Cause I'm not above you. I'm just one of you, who happened to sing a song people wanted to hear." His words flowed slow, deliberate. Each syllable was a counterweight to the accusations that lingered. The woman who had spoken wept openly now, her shoulders shaking, and something in the hall broke free. Scattered applause began again, tentative at first, then stronger, until half the room was clapping, some standing once more. The other half sat silent, torn between admiration and doubt. The tension was alive, shifting and unpredictable, like a storm cloud that refused to drift away. But Elvis remained seated, unflinching, letting the storm rage while refusing to retreat into scripted comfort. In that moment, the concert had transformed. This was no longer about entertainment. It was about trust, about identity, about whether a man wrapped in rhinestones could still convince the world that his heart had not been wrapped in the same. The stakes had risen, and the hall knew it. Elvis remained on the edge of the stage, his boots dangling, the spotlight outlining him in stark relief. The applause from the woman's testimony had begun to fade, replaced by a heavy stillness. For the first time in years, he wasn't an untouchable idol cloaked in mystery. He was just a man, breathing, vulnerable, sitting before thousands who expected him to defend his life. He lowered the microphone, rubbed his palms together slowly, as though gathering the courage to speak again. When he raised his head, his voice had lost the showman's cadence. It was quieter, weighted with something older, deeper. "Most of you don't know this," he began, scanning the room, "but back in '61, I stood on a stage in Hawaii. They called it a benefit concert, but what it really was a plea. We raised over $60,000 in one night for a memorial at Pearl Harbor, a place to honor the men who never came home. I could have kept playing shows that made me 10 times that, but I chose that stage, that night, because some things matter more than the box office." The words sank into the audience. Murmurs swept through, astonishment from those who had never heard the story, quiet nods from a few who vaguely recalled headlines long faded. Elvis leaned closer to the microphone, his expression firm but etched with weariness. "You see me in jewels and cars and planes, and you think it's all about the shine. But do you know the truth? Every day of my life, I wake up afraid it'll all disappear, afraid I'll lose it the way my family lost everything more than once. Poverty doesn't leave you. It follows you like a shadow, no matter how many lights they put on you." He paused, and the silence deepened. The confession was not defensive. It was disarming. His voice carried a tremor not of weakness, but of honesty. The audience, many of them workers and veterans of hard years, recognized the fear instantly. It was their fear, too, the fear of collapse, of bills unpaid, of children going without. He inhaled slowly, steadying himself. "So yeah, I buy rings and cars and coats, but do you know what I do more often than that?" He let the question hang before answering. "I give them away. I've handed Cadillacs to strangers just because I saw kindness in their eyes. One time, a nurse helped me when I could hardly stand, just did her job with grace, and I left her with a brand new car. Not to show off, not to prove anything, because I had it, and she didn't, and it felt right. The hall stirred. Whispers rose and fell like waves. Some clutched their programs tighter, others leaned back in their seats, processing the avalanche of revelations. Elvis's gaze softened as he continued. I don't say these things for applause. You'll never read half of it in the papers because I never wanted the cameras there. Mama taught me, if you help someone, you do it quiet. Otherwise, it's just vanity. But since you asked, since you accused, now you know. I've never been afraid to live big, but I've also never forgotten how to give big. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, not from showmanship, but from the weight of memory. He lowered his eyes, fingers tapping lightly against the microphone, letting the confession breathe in the space around him. In the audience, emotions ran wild. Some men who had glared with suspicion moments earlier now looked down at their hands, uneasy, as though ashamed of their doubt. A few women wiped tears discreetly, unwilling to let the people beside them see. Couples exchanged glances, some skeptical, some softened, many simply stunned. Elvis remained still, his shoulders slightly hunched, no longer the commanding figure who dominated arenas. He looked, for a moment, like the boy from Tupelo, still haunted by the small house with thin walls, still carrying his mother's voice in his head. And yet, beneath the vulnerability, there was undeniable strength. He had turned accusation into testimony, criticism into confession, not by defending wealth, but by exposing fear. The kind of fear every soul in the room recognized in their own bones. The silence that followed was no longer brittle. It was contemplative, heavy with the weight of recognition. Elvis tilted the microphone back to its stand, but his hand lingered on it. I'm no saint, he said quietly, but don't ever think I've forgotten. Not one day. And with that, he let the truth hang in the air, like smoke refusing to clear. The hall felt suspended in a strange balance. Elvis's words lingered in the air like smoke that refused to clear, heavy with memory, layered with truth. The audience was still processing his confession when all eyes shifted back to the man who had first shouted, the man who still clutched the gold ring in his lap. His face, once taut with anger, had begun to tremble. His jaw moved as though he wanted to speak, but the words caught. For a long moment, he sat there, rigid, as if trying to hold his fury together. But something in the weight of Elvis's honesty, something in the mention of poverty, of mothers stretching meals, of fear of losing everything, had pierced deeper than he expected. Elvis noticed the change. He leaned forward on the stage, his gaze locked firmly on the man. "Brother," he said into the microphone, his tone steady, "what is it you want from me? Do you want me to sell my house? Throw away my suits? Sleep on the sidewalk just to prove I'm the same as you?" The question cut through the theater like a blade. The audience shifted in their chairs, restless, unsettled. The guards at the side of the room stiffened, unsure if they should intervene. The man stood abruptly, the ring still clenched in his hand. His chest rose and fell with ragged breaths. At last, his voice broke loose, not in accusation this time, but in a wail that sounded less like anger and more like pain. "I lost my job," he cried, his voice cracking, desperate. "The factory closed. I've got 3 kids at home who look at me every night and ask why the cupboard's empty. I can't even buy them shoes for school." His words fell like stones into the silence. "So, when I see you, Elvis, dripping in jewels, Yes, I get angry, 'cause I don't know how to keep them fed. The revelation ripped through the crowd. A collective gasp swept the hall. Men and women turned toward him, no longer looking at an agitator, but at a father unraveling in public. His fists, once raised in defiance, now shook with helplessness. His eyes brimmed with tears that he could no longer hide. For the first time, the audience felt his outburst not as an attack on Elvis, but as a cry of despair. They saw themselves in him, the man who'd worked, struggled, and then been crushed by forces larger than himself. Elvis didn't move right away. He let the man's words hang in the air, the rawness of them filling every corner of the room. He didn't interrupt. He didn't retreat. He simply listened, head slightly bowed, as though giving the man the dignity of being heard. The crowd, meanwhile, shifted in mood. A few who had nodded in agreement with the accusations now found themselves silent, their expressions softened by empathy. Women dabbed their eyes with handkerchiefs. Men who had crossed their arms earlier now shifted uneasily, some staring at the floor. The man's voice cracked again. "I don't hate you," he said, his tone collapsing under its own weight. "I just don't know how to explain to my children why the world's so unfair." He sank back into his seat, shoulders quivering, his earlier defiance gone. The gold ring glimmered in his hand like a cruel irony, wealth and desperation colliding in his grasp. Elvis rose slowly from the edge of the stage. He stepped toward the microphone stand, then shook his head and pulled the mic loose, holding it in his hand as he paced closer to the footlights. His eyes never left the man. "I hear you," Elvis said, his voice firm yet tender. "I hear every word, and don't think I can't imagine it. 'Cause I can. I've been one bill away from ruin. I've watched my mama cry because she couldn't stretch another meal. I've been there." He paused, letting the words weigh down the room. "The difference between us is I had a guitar and a voice, and by some miracle the world listened. That's all. That's the only thing that kept me from being in your shoes tonight." The hall was utterly still. Even the doubters in the back had fallen silent, the rawness of the man's confession leaving no room for cynicism. The earlier tension between idol and accuser had transformed into something else, something fragile, human, almost unbearable. For the first time, the fan no longer looked like an opponent. He looked like a man broken open, his pain now laid bare before thousands. And for the first time, Elvis was not defending himself against hostility. He was standing before another soul's suffering, acknowledging it, sharing in it. The balance of the night had shifted once again. What began as a clash was now a communion of wounds, one man's confession meeting another's despair, both echoing across a room that no longer knew whether it was a theater, a courtroom, or a church. The room buzzed with an energy that felt almost unbearable, as if the walls themselves were trembling under the weight of what had just been confessed. The fan's breakdown had stripped the moment of all pretense. This was no longer a heckler disrupting a concert, but a man unraveling under the strain of his own life. The audience had shifted from judgment to sympathy, from scorn to silence. Elvis stood at the very edge of the stage now, holding the microphone in his right hand, his left resting lightly on his thigh. He stared down at the man, not with pity, but with something stronger. Recognition. "I could have been you," he said, his voice resonant but intimate, each syllable echoing in the stunned quiet. "If I didn't have this voice, if I didn't have these songs, brother, I would be right there, looking for work, wondering how to feed my family. Don't you ever think I'm better than you? I'm not. I'm just lucky." The words fell like a stone into water, rippling outward through every row. A murmur spread, soft, reverent. People turned to one another, nodding, whispering as if they had just heard a sermon. Some bowed their heads, others wiped their eyes. The man who had shouted sat motionless, his fists unclenched, the gold ring glinting faintly in his palm. His chest heaved with quiet sobs, his anger completely dissolved. Then Elvis did something that startled everyone, even his own men. He gestured with his hand, motioning the man to come closer. "Stand up, friend," he said softly, but the microphone carried it across the hall. "Come here. Look me in the eye, not from your seat. Let's face this as men." Gasps rippled through the audience. A woman clutched her husband's arm. Another pressed her hand against her chest. It was unthinkable. An international superstar, in a hall crawling with security and press, inviting a distraught stranger to approach the stage. The man hesitated, frozen between shame and disbelief. Slowly, shakily, he rose to his feet. The audience parted around him as though the aisle had turned into a riverbed, pushing him toward the current. His steps were uneven, his hands trembling. The security team reacted instantly. 2 guards in dark suits moved quickly toward him, one speaking into a small radio clipped at his waist. Their faces were taut with alarm. This was every protocol broken at once. Allowing a stranger to approach the stage was an unthinkable risk. "Mr. Presley, please!" one of them hissed from the corner of the stage, gesturing urgently for Elvis to step back. But Elvis shook his head firmly, never breaking his gaze from the man moving down the aisle. "No," he said into the mic, his tone resolute. "He's not my enemy. Don't touch him." The audience inhaled collectively, as if the room itself had forgotten how to breathe. The tension was at its peak. One wrong movement could send everything spiraling. Would there be a confrontation? A collapse? A disaster that tomorrow's headlines would devour? The man drew closer, his head bowed, his shoulders hunched. He looked nothing like the accuser who had shouted only minutes earlier. Now he looked like a penitent, dragged forward not by force but by his own unraveling spirit. Elvis stepped even closer to the edge of the stage, so near the footlights that shadows carved lines across his face. He leaned forward slightly, the microphone dropping lower, almost forgotten. His voice carried without the need for showmanship. "Look at me," he said, gently but firmly. The man raised his head slowly, his tear-streaked face illuminated by the stage lights. For the first time, their eyes locked. Not performer and critic, not king and subject, but man to man. The room tightened around them, the crowd reduced to a blur, thousands of witnesses to a moment that felt too intimate to be public. Elvis held his gaze. "I don't stand above you," he said quietly. "I stand with you." The words were not shouted. They didn't need to be. They rolled across the hall with the weight of truth, heavier than any guitar riff, more piercing than any high note. Around them, the audience was silent, barely daring to move. Security men twitched at the corners, but even they were caught in the gravity of the exchange, unsure whether to act or simply watch. The hall had reached its breaking point. The tension was so high it felt almost dangerous, as though the air itself might snap. Every eye was on the space between Elvis Presley and the man who had dared to call him unjust, now standing face to face. And in that fragile electric pause, the fate of the night, of Elvis's image, of the man's dignity, of the bond between star and audience hung by a thread, waiting for what Elvis would do next. The hall quivered with tension. The man now stood at the foot of the stage, his eyes red, his hand clutching Elvis's ring like an anchor. Every soul in the Hilton showroom leaned forward, waiting for the collision. Whether it would end in reconciliation or chaos, no one could tell. Security guards hovered at the edges of the aisle, their hands twitching, uncertain whether to intervene or stand down. Elvis's chest rose with a slow, steady breath. He bent slightly, his gaze fixed on the man below him. Then, without ceremony, he reached into the breast pocket of his suit and pulled out a simple white handkerchief. It looked almost absurdly plain against the glittering rhinestones of his costume. An ordinary piece of cloth in a world of sequins and gold. He extended it down, his hand open, steady. "Take this," Elvis said, his voice quiet but amplified across the hushed room. The man blinked, stunned. He didn't move. The crowd murmured, whispers bouncing from one table to another. Some thought it was a symbolic act, others a setup for a larger gesture. But Elvis's hand did not waver. The man hesitated, then reached up with trembling fingers and took the handkerchief. For a heartbeat, he simply stared at it, as if unable to comprehend why such a thing was being offered. Then he pressed it against his face, not to wave it, not to show it off, but to cover his eyes, to shield the sobs that broke loose from his chest. Elvis raised the microphone again, his expression solemn. "This man is not an enemy," he declared, his voice resonant, filling every corner of the hall. "He's a reminder of why I ever picked up a guitar, why I ever sang a note. Because music is meant to reach the hurt, not the comfortable. And tonight, he reminded me of that." The crowd erupted in applause, but it wasn't the explosive cheer of a showman's trick. It was raw, emotional, people rising to their feet not out of habit, but because they had witnessed something they couldn't quite name. Elvis lifted his free hand, signaling for quiet. Slowly, the noise dimmed again, leaving only the sound of the man's muffled crying at the foot of the stage. Elvis turned slightly, looking toward the wings. His tone sharpened. "Joe," he called to his manager, his voice echoing like a command. "Get me an envelope." The audience murmured again, unsure of what he meant. Within moments, Joe Esposito appeared at the edge of the curtain, carrying a small stack of prepared envelopes, the kind Elvis often used to tip staff or pass along gifts without ceremony. Elvis took one, weighed it briefly in his palm, then walked back to the edge of the stage. He leaned down, holding the envelope out to the man. "For your children," he said simply. "Not charity, not pity, just help from one father to another." The man's hands shook violently as he accepted it. He tried to speak, but his throat constricted, no sound emerging. His shoulders quivered with sobs he no longer tried to hide. The hall exploded, not with cynicism, not with envy, but with sheer catharsis. People clapped furiously, some shouting Elvis's name, others simply crying. The gesture was too raw, too immediate to feel staged. It was not a publicity stunt. It was an instinctive act, unplanned, born from the moment. Elvis looked out at the sea of faces before him. His eyes glistened, but his posture was firm. He raised the microphone once more. "Don't mistake this," he said. "This isn't about money. Money's paper. Gold is metal. What matters is the reminder that every one of us is fighting a battle no one else can see. And if I have the chance to lighten that load for someone, even for a night, I'll do it." The audience roared, rising to their feet again. This time the sound had a different quality. Not wild celebration, but reverence, almost gratitude. They were no longer spectators at a concert. They were participants in a moment that transcended entertainment. The man, still standing at the base of the stage, clutched the envelope in one hand, the handkerchief in the other. For the first time that night, he lifted his gaze to Elvis without anger, without accusation, only with awe, with something close to faith. And Elvis, towering above but no longer distant, looked down at him not as a star to a fan, but as one man to another. The night had shifted again, not into conflict, not into spectacle, but into something rare and fragile. A communion of souls, forged in pain and answered with compassion. The crowd could sense it. This was no scripted act. This was history unfolding in real time, and they were inside it. The Hilton showroom had transformed into something no one expected when the night began. It was no longer a concert hall, but a chamber where confession, pain, and compassion had unfolded in front of thousands of witnesses. The man who had once accused Elvis now stood trembling at the foot of the stage, clutching an envelope and a handkerchief. The crowd, still on its feet, was silent again. This time not from shock, but from reverence. Elvis remained still for several seconds, letting the hush expand until it filled every corner of the hall. Then he brought the microphone close, his voice dropping to a near whisper that carried with uncanny clarity. "Riches aren't gold," he said slowly. "They aren't Cadillacs or suits or planes. Real wealth is having someone believe in you when you don't believe in yourself. That's the only treasure I've ever trusted." The words settled over the audience like a benediction. There was no applause, not yet, only bowed heads, tears on cheeks, couples holding hands, strangers reaching across tables to grasp one another's palms. The silence was thicker than any storm, but this time it was the silence of respect, not accusation. Elvis set the microphone back on its stand, but then, almost without thought, he took it again. His gaze swept across the room, searching, restless. Finally, he gave a small nod to the orchestra conductor. No words were needed. The musicians straightened, puzzled at first, then began to shuffle through their sheets. They hadn't prepared for what he was about to call. A few strings sounded, tentative. Then the familiar opening chords rose like a slow dawn. The audience recognized it instantly. "If I can dream." Gasps fluttered across the hall. It wasn't on the program. No one expected it. Yet in this charged atmosphere, it felt inevitable, as if the night itself demanded it. Elvis closed his eyes briefly, then opened them, the light catching the moisture there. He began to sing, not with the polish of a rehearsed number, but with raw conviction, each line carrying the weight of everything that had just transpired. There must be lights burning brighter somewhere. The lyrics, already powerful, now landed like testimony. Every phrase felt sharpened by the drama of the night, each word echoing with new urgency. He sang of hope, of dreams, of the hunger for something better. And in the faces before him, men, women, skeptics, believers, the song found its true audience. People began to weep openly. Couples embraced. Strangers linked arms. It wasn't a performance anymore. It was a communal prayer, uniting the star on stage with the working-class souls in the seats. The music swelled, horns rising like a tide, strings trembling with emotion. The man who had accused Elvis remained at the foot of the stage, his body shaking with sobs. He no longer shouted, no longer demanded. He simply stood there, tears streaking his cheeks, the envelope clutched against his chest as though it were proof that the world could still surprise him with kindness. Elvis reached the climax of the song, his voice straining but pure, carrying above the orchestra like a cry that could split heaven. The hall shook with it, people rising as if pulled upward by the sheer force of his plea. "While I can dream, please let my dream come true, right now." The final note hung in the air, trembling, before fading into silence. For a fraction of a second, the hall was utterly still. as though the song had stolen even the instinct to breathe. Then the eruption came. The audience rose as one, a thunderstorm of applause and cheers, people pounding the tables, crying out his name. It wasn't the usual ovation of a Las Vegas crowd. It was something deeper, rawer, a collective acknowledgement that they had been part of something unrepeatable. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras flashed, but even they seemed small in the enormity of the moment. Tomorrow's headlines would not speak of scandal or accusations. They would speak of a night when Elvis Presley, faced with anger and doubt, turned it into communion, into unity, into hope. Elvis remained standing at the microphone, breathing heavily, sweat glistening at his temples. He looked out at the sea of faces, at the man who still stood weeping below him, and gave a small nod, not to the crowd, not to the press, but to the moment itself. He stepped back, set the microphone down gently, and whispered into the silence one last phrase, barely audible yet unforgettable. Dreams belong to all of us. With that, he walked off stage, the ovation still roaring, leaving behind not just music, not just spectacle, but the memory of a night when truth had burned brighter than diamonds,